I'd like to start, I'd like to start with acknowledging the wonderful efforts of our collaborators in Colombo, Professor Pradeep Peiris and Menika Lekamwasam at the Social Scientist Association for helping put this panel together. I'd also like to take a moment to highlight the exciting work being done at the Review of Democracy. RevDem is an open platform to discuss, analyze, and develop possible solutions to the challenges to democracy across the globe. As mentioned earlier, the journal is published by the Democracy Institute at CEU. Please check out revdem.ceu.edu for more information on the kind of work we are doing. I also encourage you to tune into our podcast series, which features an exciting range of speakers and topics on South Asia and beyond. We have three speakers today, very well-known eminent speakers. And before I introduce them, let me share the brief outline of the program. We would have about 20 minutes for each of our speakers, which would be followed by a 30-minute long Q&A. If you have questions during the talk, I encourage you to use the chat box and post your questions there. I'll relay it to the panel later. After the remarks from each of the panelists, we would open the floor to our audience who could ask the questions directly to them or use the chat box function to share their questions. And during the meeting, I'd also encourage you to please mute your phones or your devices because there would be an interruption if you have your phone or devices unmuted. We have an excellent lineup of speakers, and we cannot do justice to the incredible work they do in such a short time. So I'll confine myself to a very minimal introduction of the speakers. The first speaker is our very own Dr. Pradeep Peiris, Senior Lecturer of the Department of Political Science and Public Policy, University of Colombo, and Director and Treasurer of the Social Scientist Association, Colombo. Pradeep is currently a fellow in the International Research Consortium, Reversing the Gaze, with collaborators from the Universities of Basel and Edinburgh. Most recently, Pradeep has authored the book titled Catch All Parties and Party Voter Nexus in Sri Lanka, and edited the book titled Is the Curse Worse Than the Disease? Reflections on COVID Governance in Sri Lanka. He has also published on a wide array of subjects ranging from electoral politics to opinion polling, gender, and the democratic discourse in Sri Lanka. He is a leading survey researcher in Sri Lanka and is the country representative of the World Association for Public Opinion Research and Democracy Barometer. Welcome, Pradeep, to the panel. The second speaker is Professor Dinesha Samararatne, who you may already know in her capacity as an independent expert to the Constitutional Council of Sri Lanka. Professor Dinesha is a professor at the Department of Public and International Law at the Faculty of Law, University of Colombo. Among other things, her research interests include judicial review, public participation in constitution making, constitutional resilience, women, and constitutional law. Dinesha is also Senior Research Associate, Laureate Program in Comparative Constitutional Law, and co-convener of Constitution Transformation Network of the Melbourne Law School, Australia. Welcome, Dinesha. It's an honor to have you here. And lastly, the third speaker is Rohan Edrisinha, who is now a visiting lecturer at the University of Colombo and the standing legal advisor to the Anglican Bishop of Colombo. Between 2016 and 2023, Rohan was a senior political officer and the Constitution's advisor in the United Nations Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. He also served as the constitutional advisor to UNDP Nepal and is the founding director and head of the Legal and Constitutional Unit of the Center for Policy Alternatives, Sri Lanka. Rohan has taught at the Faculty of Law, University of Colombo, the Faculty of Law, University of the Witwatersrand, South Africa, and was a visiting fellow at the Harvard University in 2005 and the University of Toronto in 2009. Rohan has contributed widely to debates on federalism and multiculturalism in Sri Lankan politics through his very interesting and prestigious publications. Welcome, Rohan, to the event. With that, I now turn to the speakers. We will start with you, Pradeep, first and then go in the order of the introduction. Just as a quick reminder, we have about 20 minutes for each of you, and I would indicate to you the time through chat or through this window here. So Pradeep, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anubha, and thank you for RevDem for organizing this important discussion. It's very rare for the democratic scholars to present their own democratic the elections in a very positive terms. So today I'm extremely happy, while the rest of the South Asia is struggling with their own democracies and with all sort of issues, Sri Lanka, and we have a positive story to tell you all. I mean, not only South Asia, I think beyond everywhere, you see a lot of challenges that the democracies are struggling with. And on the contrary, I have a good story. So where, one may characterize this recent election outcome as a tectonic change in Sri Lankan electoral politics. In terms of the election process and also its outcome, and also in terms of its repercussion, I think the magnitude of the effect it has on Sri Lankan democracy is unparalleled. This is one of the most peaceful election that we experience. Not only Sri Lankans, but also the international observers really commenting about the how elections were held in Sri Lanka. And also this is basically a very serious shift from very serious shift from the our traditional electoral practices, as well as its outcome. Now, for example, I can list down few for the benefit of our viewers today. Now, in democratic, Sri Lankan's democracy literature, we never thought that we never thought that a single party can make such a resounding victory with a 2/3 majority in the parliament seat is possible under a proportional electoral system. So literature always discuss about the difficulty in terms of having such majority under PR system. So this election has produced for the first time since the introduction of PR system, where people have given such a clear majority to the current government, National People's Power, and they have. It seems that people have taken them their proposals very seriously. The electoral program, they have taken it very seriously. And also these results also clearly indicate that people have rejected the traditional political parties and traditional political party cultures. So in that way, for the first time since the independence, we have experienced a group of politicians outside of the traditional standard political the parties and lines to emerge and capture political power in Sri Lanka through very peaceful elections, right? And also this election is very, very important for the fact that it has also it has produced a result where there are many the number of women's participation has really increased in this election. So now we have about 21 women parliamentarian, and not only the women parliamentary increase the representation of women parliamentary, also the it included as well as increase the participation of disabled as well as people from LGBT community. So in that way, it's pretty salient the outcome of this election, and also Sri Lankan democracy was suffering and struggling. Not only Sri Lanka, this is the case across most of the South post-colonial state. With this, democracies were struggling with the patronage politics, where the where the countries where the party voter, relationship was very much have transformed into a transactional kind of a, relationship. As a result, the parties and politicians, managed to get into, parliament, the officers, like, by distributing various perks and, patronage goods. For the first time, where a party, the NPP, managed to, like, come and really, like, capture the government, or, like, got so much of support, completely going against the patronage politics. So which was which basically like was basically against the expectation. I mean, because all this time last, since the independence, parties, they extensively use this patronage politics to, like, get into parliament. And also there's another very interesting development we also observe in this election, that is also for the first time, where the NPP have showed us, like, they can win the election by being ethnic neutral, because all this time Sri Lankan politics, not only like independence, even prior to the independence, Sri Lankan elections was very much exploited, like very much use the ethnicity, or the ethnic tension. The politicians capitalize the ethnic tension in order to, like, get attracted to the voters. So this time, the like this election, for the first time, we see that ethnicity, the nationalism played very minimal role in this election. But NPP made a victory completely, like, going away from this nationalist politics by being neutral in terms of ethnicity, and also I think the one of the most salient achievement in this election is that for the first time again, this southern political party managed to, like, win 21 districts out of all 23 electoral districts in the country, which means that including north and east as well. So this is very, very salient, where, like, for the first time, the entire country came together in supporting this single party. So in that way, like, what I want to say is, like, not only the process was very peaceful, very democratic, while, very much different to the rest of the South Asia, but also the outcome also extremely profound in terms of, like, it shows that the democratic credential, it shows that it gives you so much hope about the future of Sri Lankan democracy. But this also has very, very serious repercussions, very serious, impact on Sri Lankan democratic future. I mean, one of the things would be, like, now NPP is in power with necessary, like, they have been given necessary power to change and implement whatever the policies that they see as needed for this country, or whatever they have proposed. I mean, they in their electoral manifestos, they campaign the election with so much of, like, progressive proposals, right? And now they have power. They've been given power to, like, implement those proposals, which were not possible to, like, many other parties throughout the history, given the fact that none of them enjoy this much of the power in the parliament, right? So, and also the nature, the way that they made the victory, also it's very possible for the NPP to really make a very huge change in the Sri Lankan democratic landscape, right? Because they can, for example, now they're in a capacity to, like, introduce a new constitution, which will address the grievances of minorities, which will address some of the issues with regard to, like, the like more authoritarian, the features in the constitutions. So you have all the opportunity to now change it if they genuinely desire it, right? So So in that way, that the repercussion of like the electoral outcome is huge, and that's why I started by saying that, I mean, this could be characterized as a kind of a tectonic change in Sri Lankan politics, because you can really, like, change the system that they promise, like before the election. I mean, remember, like, they came to election with the support that they got from the youth, young people, and particularly those who really came to protest against the traditional parties, who basically disappointed Sri Lankans, like, and bringing this huge economic crisis to the country. So I think that now the NPP is in a full capacity to transform the Sri Lankan society into more democratic. Not They can even push forward the Sri Lankan democracy beyond the procedural nature of democracy, and to deliver more substantive democratic, the goods. But also, I want to flag one thing before I end this presentation. While I really welcome this resounding victory and two-third majority, I mean, that gives me a kind of strong confidence, and then at least, like, they have managed to consolidate to, like, produce what they promised. But also, I think we must not blindly think that the such a majority only can produce positive things. I mean, unchecked majority can also can backfire at them as well. So I think the people like us who are supporters and who are well wishers of the current government, I think we do have kind of a very serious responsibility and keep them intact, and then also, like, and I think we need to, like, hold them accountable as well. Otherwise, unchecked, the power will lead to corruption and lead to kind of a so much of oppression. I mean, this will, because we must also remember the NPP is a party. All this time we have associated them as an opposition party, but today now is in governments, which means that now they're exposed to, like, more criticism, and their real capacities and incapacities is going to be now out now. So there will be more criticism. So as the criticism increases, the resistance increases, there's a chance of, like, they can also maybe, trying to, exploit their to the majority. So I think while we are very appreciating, while we are very commending, while we are very jubilant about our electoral outcome, we need to be a bit cautious. We should not really keep the blind faith in this victory. Thank you.
Dinesha, would you like to continue the conversation?
Yeah, thanks, Anu. Thanks for getting us started, Pradeep. I just want to say that I participated in this discussion in my academic capacity, and what I'm going to be sharing today is shaped and limited also by the public office that I hold part-time, which is that of an independent member of the council. So I will probably not speak to some of the observations made by Pradeep, but I'll come at this general election result from a slightly different angle. I agree with Pradeep in that I think one of the words that best captures what we've experienced is the phrase a tectonic shift. And even though, so of course in 2022, we also kept describing some of the developments that we experienced as also being unprecedented and entirely unexpected. But even from the perspective of the experiences of 2022, the election results have been the least expected. So in the time allocated to me, I'm going to try and make 8 points extremely briefly. I'll begin by drawing attention to the limits and risks that are involved in this kind of discussion, and most importantly for me, by drawing attention to the limits of my disciplinary methods in commenting on political developments in real time. I will then comment very briefly on the elections themselves to draw attention to the significance of institutions and law for transitions to the extent that what we are living through is a political transition. Third, I want to explore the implications of the general elections to the argument that several of us have been making about state capture in Sri Lanka. Fourth, I want to revisit the distinction Professor Jayadeva Uyangoda has made. He's, I think, actually on this call. The distinction he made between voters and citizens in Sri Lanka during the Aragalaya or Horatam of 2022. Building on those third and fourth points, I will comment on what I think is the process that is unfolding this week, the institutionalization of the democratic aspirations of this political moment in this country. My fifth and sixth points draw more directly from my own discipline, which is public law, and I will try to interpret what these election results could hold for prospects for constitutional reform and for ejecting ourselves out of what I have described elsewhere as constitutional reform in Sri Lanka. Finally, I want to end by offering some broad reflections on human agency and what it has perhaps meant to many of us to live through these times here in this country. So turning now to my first point about disciplinary limits to interpreting the results of the general elections of November 2024. I'm a student of public law, which includes constitutional law. Lawyers and law academics are best trained in legal doctrine and the design and function of legal institutions. However, even the most hardcore litigator has a position on the values that inform the law. In constitutional law, our ability to remain committed to values that advance constitutionalism, including respect for human dignity and rights, is determined by the political domain. This is why constitutional law is closely associated with political science and theory. However, and this is the main point I want to make here, when law academics like myself comment on political developments, we speak from a limited set of skills. We can speak to correlation, but almost never about causation. So it's best to take the reflections I offer now with a generous pinch of salt. The second point is about the general election itself, and I will make this point quickly, mostly to place this moment in some historical context. It is difficult to deny that since 2022, there was a demand for change of government. However, the government of the day chose to remain in power and chose to indefinitely delay the local government elections. What we had for 2 years was a government that was within the technical boundaries of constitutionality under our constitution, but arguably lacking in legitimacy, and a government which deliberately weakened the representative democracy. This I see as an outright denial of the political demands made by the people in 2022. At this point, the people, of course, had limited options, but key institutions of the state were mobilized by the people to seek some remedies. The fundamental rights petitions challenging the non-release of funds for local government elections is perhaps one of the most significant of the remedies that were pursued. That process, which even involved threats to the independence of our judiciary, culminated in a judgment delivered in October this year, which held the President and the Election Commission responsible for the failure to conduct timely elections to local government authorities. In relation to the presidential and general elections conducted this year, they are the first set of elections subject to the Regulation of Election Expenditure Act of 2023. The actual effect of this law can, of course, now be studied, but I think it is important to note that several stakeholders have advocated for many decades for this law to be enacted. These elections have also been noteworthy in terms of the, as Pradeep mentioned, the absence of violence, as well as the absence of the political performances that we have witnessed in and around election results. Credit, in my view, is owed to the Election Commission. It is useful to recall here that although this commission was established in 2001, it was constituted only in 2016. Although Sri Lanka is in its 9th decade of procedural democracy, our Election Commission is a relatively young constitutional institution. This is perhaps the first time the Commission functioned more as an institution with almost no focus on the individual commissioners. These are perhaps signs of an independent institution in its consolidation phase, entering its consolidation phase, and its development as an institution that can perhaps in the future not only guarantee effective electoral management, but also electoral integrity. Turning now to my substantive points about these election results. My third point today is about state capture. Several of us have invoked this concept in interpreting political, economic, and constitutional developments in Sri Lanka, particularly in the last 2 years. By state capture, broadly, I mean the negation of checks and balances in constitutional governance through the systematic abuse of discretion that is vested with elected and public officials. The state, in this scenario, is captured by state actors for private and or personal gain. In my view, the degree of state capture in Sri Lanka was such that even bankruptcy and mass human suffering and sustained organic protests, could not dislodge it. If state capture explains Sri Lanka's situation, it also follows that a reset of some sort is required to actually deal with it. Now, at the risk of sounding overly optimistic, I want to suggest today that the 2 elections, but particularly the general elections, have effectively brought about this reset. Now, this is most definitely not to say that we have therefore returned to a more democratic state that will guarantee constitutional governance. Rather, it is to say that one of the fundamental conditions necessary to address Sri Lanka's state capture is now present. My fourth point is a related one. In 2022, Jayadev Uyangoda helpfully invoked a distinction between our political behavior as voters and as citizens. This distinction helped us to articulate the need for people to see the interdependence between politics, the economy, governance, and democracy, and of course the individual and the state. Many of us, out of desperation, exerted our political agency and asked for a system change. During this time, the different forms of political dissent that had hitherto been ignored and relegated to the margins of Sri Lankan politics found resonance with the mainstream. It could very well be that in 2024, 2 years later, we have used the ballot to translate that engagement into an electoral result. The political status quo, as Pradeep has already described, has been dislodged in multiple ways, literally resulting in the actualization of the Desiya Visipahama Epa, or we don't want all 225 MPs in Parliament demand of 2022. And there's more to be said, but I won't do that today. But except perhaps to recall an obvious point. The political momentum for accountability that emerged in 2022 was hemmed in and subverted by and through legal institutions and the law. We all remember how this unfolded. The demand for regime change was reduced to a technical resignation and re-election of a new president by parliament. And the hard work of rebuilding a bankrupt economy was largely reduced to the demands of the IMF. But today, in 2024, we now have an opportunity to look afresh at how we can learn from and deal with Sri Lanka's polycrisis. This takes me to my next point about how the results of these elections may translate into the realm of constitutional law. Constitutional institutions can have a flattening effect on political critique. How can the demand for a system change remain alive when those who are expected to represent that demand become the very institution that they have critiqued? This is what Pradeep also said in different ways. Here, in my view, political culture will be decisive. If we accept that corruption is entrenched in our political and institutional cultures, to what extent can the change in representation deal with it within a window of 5 years in any meaningful ways? This is the point at which a responsible and effective opposition becomes essential. The role of the opposition in a semi-presidential system is largely determined through convention. We have seen some of the ways in which this has been effective, but in Sri Lanka, we have also seen how this has largely been ineffective. In Sri Lanka, we have, along with a few other jurisdictions, a mechanism which provides the opposition more opportunity than in a conventional parliamentary system to contribute to governance. I have in mind here the role of the opposition in the Constitutional Council. At least by design, and I'm only going to comment on design here, they can ensure accountability of a government for the function of constitutional institutions, commissions, and several other legislative institutions. But beyond the role of the opposition, citizens too have a heavy burden to discharge in realizing the prospects we now have for system change. This will require the active use of opportunities for participating in the public life of the country through litigation, through participation in the work of independent commissions, but also through direct public engagement and dissent. Now, it is often said that constitutional reform is the strongest form of consolidating a demand for political change. In fact, a new constitution has been promised in the run-up to these elections, including the most important promise, that of abolishing the executive presidency. As we look to the future in anticipation of these reforms, we ought to remind ourselves yet again of the hard work that lies ahead of us as citizens in holding the new government to account on fulfilling this promise, as well as addressing the other long-standing demands of the people, including a solution to the ethnic conflict, independence of the public service, a more substantive set of protections for our fundamental rights, and reform of key constitutional institutions such as the Office of the Attorney General. It is useful to recall here that our new Prime Minister was a member of the Public Representations Committee that received public representation on constitutional reforms in 2016. On the question of constitutional reform, since 2001, Sri Lanka has experienced abrupt pendulum swings, which I have described elsewhere as constitutional ping-pong. This constitutional ping-pong has been a result of changes in the dynamics of representative democracy, abrupt changes. It seems to me that the democratic conditions may be ripe for coming out of this rally of constitutional ping-pong and for the adoption of a fit-for-purpose constitution for Sri Lanka. Much will depend not only on the early actions of the government, but also on our ability to hold them accountable. Finally, in closing, I would like to briefly reflect on our unknown collective political future by looking back. Sorry, I'm glancing because there's lightning where I am. We are in that in-between phase in a political transition where the possibilities for imagining a new political future remains alive. The hope that many feel, which Pradeep articulated as well, comes as a reaction to the despair, frustration, and suffering that many felt, particularly in 2022. But it is not only that. We can keep going back in our political history to recall the numerous accounts of despair, discrimination, suffering, violence, and death, which is entangled with the demand for better collective political futures here in Sri Lanka. If we look at each of those episodes, it may seem as if they were accounts of failure. But looking back on the 93 years of Sri Lanka's procedural democracy, we see that multiple and competing narratives are possible. Narratives of hope or despair or of mindless chaos. Whichever way we feel inclined to interpret our political history will also influence how we interpret our political future. Such is the precarity and contingency of our human existence. And I think only time will tell how this particular episode in our political history will pan out. Thanks, Anu.
Thank you for that very humbling and thoughtful conclusion, Dinesha. Rohan, the floor is yours. Please take over.
Thank you, Anuba, and thank you to the Review of Democracy and SSA for inviting me to be part of this panel. I too, like Dinesha, would just like to flag a few issues to facilitate the discussion. I'd like to underscore, obviously, what everyone has said so far, and that is that I think it is important to understand this particular election result as a massive protest vote against the political elite. And also, very interestingly, and I'd like to touch, sort of expand on it a little bit, the established political parties and party system. So I think, the people saw the political class, and particularly the politicians in our elected assemblies, as being motivated primarily by self-interest. They got totally fed up with the vanity projects, the corruption, the kickbacks, commissions, the nepotism. And we've seen over a period of time that the old established political parties that we were all very familiar with, the parties that go back to post-independence period, have either disappeared or become irrelevant. So just to give you a few examples, the grand old party, the United National Party, has now virtually ceased to exist. And that's because over a period of time, there was no internal party democracy. You had, 100-person working committee being appointed by the leader and then appointing the leader. And so sycophancy and loyalty to the party leader was the crucial aspect for rising within a political party. And so not surprisingly, the party decayed and became irrelevant. And so you had the breakaway party, the SJB, contesting the parliamentary election. You saw a similar trend with the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, the SLFP, where you had the SLPP emerging from the SLFP, the Rajapaksa-dominated party, and you have the SLPP contesting the election. Similarly with the old left, the venerable old parties, the LSSP, the NSSP, they became old and fossilized, and and then you saw the rise of the JVP instead, and younger people being drawn to the JVP rather than the old left. You saw this even with the TULF, the mainstream, the main Tamil political party, splitting, then coming together in a new formation, the TNA also now getting divided. So there have been lots of interesting changes with respect to our political party system. And you have the shells of the old parties remaining, the breakaway new parties contesting. And I think it'll be very interesting to see in the months and years ahead how this sort of settles. The dangers, of course, of the old party system going away is that there's a lack of clarity now about ideology, what different parties stand for. The political parties seem to be more personality-based, easier, therefore, to be co-opted by the party in power. And so I think this is a worrying trend for liberal democracy. And I think we need to hope that there is the party system sort of renews itself and there emerges a kind of clarity with respect to what political parties stand for. Now, I'd like to also flag the interesting point about the NPP. The NPP is a coalition, as was said earlier by Pradeep, and it's a JVP plus. The JVP is clearly the dominant force within the NPP. And I suspect, I mean, everyone is very positive at the present moment, but I suspect that in the months and years ahead, there could be internal tensions between the JVP and the rest of the other groups who constitute the larger NPP. And, I'm not sure. It will be very interesting to see how many of the new members of parliament identify with the JVP and how many identify with the NPP. And so this could be an interesting area of tension, of conflict. And I suspect that because the JVP is such a disciplined party, that they'll be able to manage this and perhaps also turn to the manifesto whenever there are issues and tensions. I also would like to underscore what Dinesha and Pradeep have already said about the complete lack of confidence that people had in democratic institutions. And as a student of constitutional law, obviously, I'm very concerned about this. But I'd like to highlight one, since we're talking about the parliamentary election. I think there needs to be a fundamental rethink about the role of parliament in a constitutional democracy. it seems to me that over the years, the Parliament as the focus, as the locus of policy debate, of deliberation, of scrutiny, of a watchdog on the executive has failed, partly because of constitutional reasons. And so the overmighty executive president has co-opted the legislature, and the legislature was unable to fulfill its basic functions. But I'd like to flag one issue which I think is important, and I hope it comes up if constitutional reform is seriously on the agenda, on the table, is the relationship between members of parliament and their political parties. I think it's very important that we get the balance right between giving members of parliament a certain freedom and autonomy to exercise their independent judgment and balance that with their role as representatives of the people and also ambassadors of political parties. I think another reason why the NPP was able to win so big at the parliamentary election as opposed to the presidential election, and Anuba, you raised this in your introductory comments, is that that President Dissanayaka and the small cabinet that he had behaved very well so that they were able to dispel the fear factor that a lot of people might have had about giving the NPP and the JBP power, right? So on the economic front, you saw that President Dissanayaka retained senior officials in the treasury. He even kept an obviously political appointee, the Sri Lankan ambassador to Washington, in position, presumably, in order to demonstrate that he wanted a certain amount of continuity with regard to the extremely challenging issue of dealing with the economic crisis. And I want to identify with Dinesha's points about our limits. Certainly I am not knowledgeable enough about economics to be able to say anything useful on this subject, but I just want to recognize that this is going to be one of the main challenges faced by the new government. But the government sort of instilled confidence in people in the way, in particular, the president spoke, the way he behaved. Some would say the government even went too far. There was an ambiguous statement about repealing the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which aroused a lot of concern in civil society. Minister Herat seemed to be excessively cautious about Muslim law reform, which again evoked some concerns. But it was that simplicity, that directness in President Dissanayaka's statements, the three individuals, the president, the prime minister, and Vijitha Herat, who probably came across as reassuring. They're certainly the more moderate elements within the government. And so I think they allayed the fear factor. And also it was such a contrast, the acquired dignity, to the antics of the previous President Wickremesinghe, who was rushing all over the place and criticizing everyone, both in Parliament, where he shouldn't have been, and outside. The next issue I'd like to flag is the very interesting development about minority politics, right? As Pradeep said, the NPP was able to capture a substantial degree of support among the Tamil and Muslim communities. Now, the decline of support for the traditional Tamil party, the ITAC, what does this mean? I think there are some interesting issues there. I don't have the answers. I'm raising some questions. Does this mean that the Tamil people have got tired of identity politics? Or was it just a protest vote against the mainstream Tamil political parties because of their division, their squabbling, their inability to deliver? Or again, was it a feeling among Tamil youth in particular that Tamil nationalist politics is unrealistic and possibly even irrelevant in Sri Lanka's current political reality? There's some speculation that caste played a factor, and so that this was a kind of protest vote against the more conservative Tamil parties. Now, what can the NPP deliver and what can't it? I suspect that the NPP government might be able to deliver on reducing the militarization in the north, returning more land to the people of the north, maybe the release of more political prisoners, investment in the north and the east. And I should note, I should say that even now there is opposition to this. There have been Buddhist monks on YouTube who have said reducing the military and giving back land means, helping the Tamils to get self-determination. And so I think the new government will have to deal with this very sensitively. But I think those are the areas where they might be able to deliver. I'm less optimistic about their ability to deliver into the difficult question of investigation into alleged war crimes, what happened in the last days of the war, what some of the UN resolutions are concerned about. There's also the interesting issue about how is the government going to deal with the question of devolution. I said earlier that there's a little bit of now uncertainty as to what the Tamil people want with respect to devolution. Is it still 13th Amendment plus? Is it the case that devolution is something that is important for the Tamil political elites and for India, but maybe ordinary Tamil people are more interested in other issues? There's the intriguing question of the role of the Tamil diaspora, which, often sits in their armchairs in Canada and Australia and then takes very extreme hardline positions on self-determination and homeland, etc. But they have a lot of influence through the money that they send to Sri Lanka. There's also the question of the Malaya Makkal, the Tamils in the upcountry region. It's interesting that there are two representatives from that community in the cabinet. Working and living conditions in those areas need to be dealt with. There are huge social mobility and education questions. And it seems possible that the NPP might be able to deliver on those because it's much more in keeping with the NPP's ideological perspectives and priorities. And then, of course, there's the intriguing question of Muslim politics, where a number of younger Muslim people, I would presume, rejected the Muslim parties and voted for the NPP. Rauf Hakim and Badiuddin, the leaders of the Muslim parties, barely managed to get into parliament. It's obvious that large numbers of Muslims and Muslim professionals voted for the NPP. And I think it's ironic that for the first time since independence, a Sri Lankan cabinet does not include a representative from the Muslim community. And this has obviously generated a lot of criticism of the new government. It's probably their first big issue on which they've been criticized. The cabinet was announced on Monday. Was this done because the NPP genuinely believed in a kind of meritocratic approach to the appointment of the cabinet, or was this a blunder? And so it raises the larger issues of how does the NPP deal with the minority question? Are they going to take the view, as some people have said, we're all Sri Lankans, you must forget about the fact that we're Sinhalese, Tamils, and Muslims, or do they recognize that inclusion, and I would think inclusion in the executive branch, the cabinet, that is very important. So there are these old demands: autonomy, devolution, recognition of identity. Have they been placed on the back burner? Do they still exist? I think these are interesting questions that we'll have to look at closely and see how the new government responds. A word about constitutional reform, even though Dinesha has touched on this. I'd just like to say that in my view, it is vital that we have a completely new constitution. It is more than the abolition of the executive presidency. We don't have a constitution that is supreme. We have, therefore, a system that encourages the executive to try and smuggle through unconstitutional legislation without any public discussion, pre-enactment. We need to improve the Bill of Rights, and Dinesha has worked on this to include economic, social, and cultural rights. The Attorney General's department role with respect to checking legislation for constitutionality has over the years been abysmal, and that has got to change. The issue of the role of Parliament, access to justice, fundamental rights applications have to be filed in Colombo. We need to sort of broad base that and give that jurisdiction to the High Court in the provinces. The issue of the 13th Amendment, full implementation, or as some people in the NPP have suggested, are there other ways of addressing Tamil aspirations, and how will the Tamil community respond to that? I'd also like to say, even though Pradeep and Dinesh referred to it, I think that it's still quite shocking that Sri Lanka has less than 10% of women in its legislature, when compared with legislatures in other parts of the world, especially even in South Asia. I think that's still shockingly low. And though we obviously welcome that there's been an improvement, I think less than 10% is not enough. Remember, Nepal has more than 30%. And the last point that I'd like to make on constitutional reform is that, the fact that the NPP has got a 2/3 majority highlights the dangers of a government with a 2/3 majority trying to initiate constitutional reform. We have never, in post-independence Ceylon or Sri Lanka, had a proper constitution, which is a consensus document. 72 and 78 were both fundamentally flawed because they were partisan documents introduced by governments with 2/3 majorities. And so, saying, well, we can now have a new constitution because the government has a 2/3 majority, I think fails to understand why the 2/3 majority requirement is introduced in the first place for constitutional reform. So I hope that the NPP will take steps to reach out to the opposition and to the various social groups in Sri Lanka and devise a roadmap to ensure that the process of constitutional reform is participatory, is inclusive, and also perhaps builds on what has been done in the past. Harini and Lal Vijayanayake are both part of the government. They did a lot of work in 2015 to 16, as Dinesh said, maybe even build on some of the things that were done earlier. It's going to be a real challenge because I think a new constitution, it has to be adopted within a year or two of the parliamentary election, but at the same time, the government doesn't want to be seen to be rushing it through. So that balance between consultation and participation on the one hand, and a sense of urgency and doing it in the first year or two of the new government, I think is crucial. Anuba, how much more time do I have? Can I just flag two more issues and then end? Very briefly. So there's one area which I think really needs reform, and that is with respect to education and educational policy. And I'm very happy that the Prime Minister, Harini Amarasuriya, has kept the education and higher education portfolio. Our secondary school system, the national curriculum is poor and uninspiring. Our national examination system does not promote imagination, critical thinking, and more parents are taking their children out of the national education system, letting them go into the international, which is totally unregulated, by the way. And then when they go into the international, they cannot go to the local university system. And so you're actually encouraging people to leave the country. So attempts at reform in the past have come up with a kind of mafia in the Ministry of Education, which is resistant to change, very conservative. And I know that the Prime Minister has no illusions about the challenges that she has in this area, but it's something that I think civil society needs to support the government on. There's also this tension between the elite state schools, which get a lot of state money, and the neglected state schools outside the cities, unregulated international schools, as I said, and also the politicization of universities. I think it's a scandal that the President of the Republic appoints our vice chancellors, and I hope some changes will be made on that front. And the last point that I'd like to flag, and I noticed that there are some people who have far more knowledge on this in the audience than I do, is to just say that the big challenge also for the government is going to be the economic crisis. The president has kept the finance portfolio to himself, which I've always argued is unconstitutional and bad practice from a representative democracy point of view. The Minister of Finance has got to be in Parliament if Parliament is going to have full and effective control over public finance, but probably it's because it's such an important issue. The IMF agreement, debt repayment, there are issues of policy and capacity. I think people are worried about the capacity of the government, but so far, as I said, the government has demonstrated pragmatism on that front. What parts of the agreement can we renegotiate? Is it possible to ensure that the poorer sections of the community of Sri Lankan society are protected in some way from the bitter medicine that obviously the entire country has to swallow in the years ahead? The subsidies, health, education, welfare, electricity, water, reducing the public sector, how is that going to be done? Excessive expenditure on the military. Will the government be able to take some tough decisions about pruning the public sector and cutting money for the military? There's also an intriguing question about the consequences of a particular piece of legislation introduced by Ranil Wickremesinghe, the Economic Transformation Act 2024, which apparently has binding commitments which reduce the ability of the government, its discretion. How is the government going to deal with that? And the question then, of course, is, will the government decide to impose new taxes on the rich and the privileged, which I know a lot of people have said needs to be done? These are obviously intriguing questions. I just thought I needed to flag those, even though I'm not at all knowledgeable about economics, as that's obviously going to be an important issue for the new government in the months ahead. I think I'll stop there, Anubha. Thank you very much for your patience.
Absolutely. Thank you for keeping time. This is a very disciplined panel for the moment of celebration that we're talking about. So thank you for keeping your time, and we would like to invite our audience. I already see a couple of questions floating in the chat box, but before we open the floor for the audience questions, in the spirit of this election verdict, let me exercise my moderator privilege and start off the discussion by asking each one of you a question. So Pradeep, we'll start with you. And I was really heartened by your reference to the broadening of electoral base in Sri Lanka. I was especially glad to hear you mention the participation of women and LGBTQ communities in the elections. But I did want to ask you to reflect on the politics on the other side of the story here, which is the future of coalition politics in Sri Lanka. As many of you know, Sri Lanka has a long history of coalition politics. You also talked about how the election was indicative of the implosion or weakening of patronage politics in Sri Lanka that fed the broad political coalitions. So with JVP choosing not to, that's my alarm. Sorry. With JVP choosing not to align with any major political party, does this outcome suggest a shift in the organization and role of political parties in the country? What do these elections results indicate for the future of coalition politics in Sri Lanka? Your comments briefly on this.
Yeah, thank you, Anubhav. I think I really missed that point. I really wanted to point out it. I mean, clearly the electoral results, the outcome is a very significant departure from our standard electoral practices. But that doesn't mean that that's the end of the story. So, I mean, the new changes that what we are witnessing right now, it's too early for us to say that they are permanent or whether they are just a kind of one-off random, occurrence. So I believe, I believe it's the latter. Look, I mean, what you see right now is a kind of particular moment of like weakening of patronage politics, the completely the weakening of the traditional elite base party politics, But I am sure with various changes, because what the electoral system that we experienced for more than 75 years, or maybe even more than that, cannot really expect to be wither away overnight. So I mean, of course, this is clearly a kind of a decline and the defeat for that old system. But I'm a bit cautious to claim it as this is the end of such politics. So I guess right now we have a NPP-led, JVP-led NPP government. So as long as they manage to keep the economy intact, as long as they manage to produce some of the promises that they made, they will be able to successfully finish their term. But through the process, you may get to see that how the traditional parties will come back at them. So that's why I am a bit cautious to say that okay, this is a kind of a shift, a permanent shift, or whether this is some sort of temporary shift. So I mean, my guess is this, the frustration, disappointment with the old system has resulted in the current political reality. But it's too early for us to think that this is the entirely new journey.
Thank you for that thought-provoking response. Moving on to another aspect of election verdict, I thought, and this is a question to you, Dinesha, I thought it would be great if you could elaborate on the role of the 2022 movement. I would like you to talk about how this movement contributed to the political verdict we see today. How did the JVP and Anura convince voters that they were the right candidates to secure a system change? And then finally, in the past 2 months, how have the voters responded to AKD's presidency? How well do you think they have transitioned from being protesters to voters? Your comments, please.
That's a difficult question to respond, but I will try. But also, just to react to the exchange you and Pradeep had, I think whether or not this transition that we see can be sustained will depend on whether we as people who live in Sri Lanka are willing to live with the absence of patronage politics. If I generalize, we are used to being able to use connections, privileges, different types of access to obtain certain benefits. Rohan spoke about the school system and national schools. We all have either first-hand or third-hand experience in how access to some of these schools are determined. So I think if it comes to a situation where patronage politics is significantly reduced, whether people will accept that and be willing to live with the consequences will be perhaps a good test of the sustainability of what has unfolded in these couple of months in Sri Lanka. On the 2022 movement, much has been written, much has been said, and it's difficult to sort of capture all of that in a few minutes. But speaking, and now I speak more as someone who's also experienced it as a person living through that moment. I think, like I mentioned before, the sort of the sheer scale of what we experienced helped people to reject, as Rohan said, the status quo. It was almost out of the lack of any other option. And if we look back, I think one of the few political movements or parties that was able to capture that frustration was perhaps the NPP in how, as Rohan mentioned, how they present themselves as being different to everything that we've seen before. But, and this is not something I want to comment on, but there is a longer history to within the NPP, the JVP and its politics in Sri Lanka. So we've seen, I think over the decades, significant shifts which has brought us to where we are today. And in terms of translating our 2022 experience to an electoral outcome, it is the lack of other alternatives that perhaps led people to change their the way in which they participate in politics. Did people put collective interest before self-interest? It's hard to tell. I mean, that's what you would, I mean, if you're thinking ideally in terms of how elections should work, you want people to think of larger interests, whether people did that or whether it was just mostly a protest vote. It's hard to tell, but like I said, I think if promises that were made are kept and the consequences flow to us, and we are willing to live with those consequences, perhaps we can then perhaps interpret this result even better. Thanks.
Yeah, just to clarify, I thought we interpret these election verdicts separate and distinct from what happened in 2022, or are there very dense connections between the two moments? Are we living in the same revolutionary moment, or is there something else that's going on that could be interpreted from this moment, from this election results? But thanks, Tanisha, that was very comprehensive. I'll move on to you, Rohan. My next question is to you. And I was wondering if you talked about reforms. And so I was wondering, some people have interpreted this election verdict as a political earthquake. And so how might this unprecedented mandate impact governance and reforms in Sri Lanka? What could and I know this question is probably to both of you, Dinesh and Rohan, what could the constitutional and economic reforms look like under such significant popular support? Is this a final goodbye to nepotism and patronage? I know, Tanisha, you partly answered this question. Or is there a way in which patronage and charisma still matter in the country? What are some of the broad trends so far?
Anuba, I apologize. I found it difficult to get every part of your question, but let me just sort of touch on what I think the core issues of constitutional reform are. I think your question was based on that. So I'd just like to say that in Sri Lanka, we love to debate the substance of constitutional reform. And we've had these debates for years, presidential versus parliamentary executives, electoral systems, what is the mix between PR and first past the post and the Bill of Rights and things. And, a lot of wise commentators have said that the problem with Sri Lanka is that we know a lot about substance, but we don't pay sufficient attention to the process by which we engage in constitutional reform. And that's what I tried to highlight in my comments. I think the government will have to really think carefully about the process that it's going to adopt. Because of the urgency and because of that need to broaden the engagement to bring the opposition and other stakeholders involved. And I think that they might want to think about having parallel tracks. President Premadas had something called an all-party conference, where he got political parties to meet under his chairmanship to discuss constitutional questions. You have the select committee route. You have the public representations route, which Vijay Naik chaired, which has been done, where you have all those materials. I think it might be useful to have parallel tracks, acknowledge the work that has been done in the past, say that you're going to make use of those, and then proceed with a certain amount of urgency so that one has a draft constitution by the end of next year or early 2026, because then, you have to get it through parliament and then have a referendum thereafter. So process is as important as substance. I think that's what I'd like to flag at this point. Thank you.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I just realized I was on mute. So the floor is open to the audience. I already saw a question in the chat box, and this is a question to Dinesha. The audience, you can unmute yourself, you can turn the video on and introduce yourself briefly to the panel and ask a question directly to them. You can also use the chat function and type your questions here. I would be happy to relay the questions to our panelists. I have a question from Paba for Dinesha. She asks, can you clarify/elaborate how the recent election results correlate with or affect state capture? And this is a reference to what you were talking about in your presentation.
Thanks for that question, Paba. Yeah, so as I mentioned in my remarks, if state capture does explain what we have been experiencing, particularly in the last couple of years, there had to be a mechanism through which there was an opportunity for a reset. So if you recall, in 2022, several ideas were floated, and in fact, Bangladesh is a interesting comparison to what Sri Lanka has been experiencing, but they have gone down a different path. Sri Lanka has remained within the constitution and chosen a different path. And in Sri Lanka's chosen path, what we have now is that opportunity for reset through representative democracy. Through the result of elections, there has been an unexpected reset. Political actors, political parties that hitherto had a sort of entrenched, established role in parliament are either no more or in a minority in the opposition. And we have new actors. And there's much more that can be said. And in fact, that's the public debate these days about who is in our new parliament. And parliament is looking very different. There are so many examples we can take. Pradeep has already mentioned, for the first time, we have visually impaired member of parliament. Even though I would agree with Rohan that women's representation is still dismal in Sri Lanka, it's still double what we had before, which is hugely significant. And coincidentally, we now have, in December, we will have a woman chief justice, second woman chief justice in Sri Lanka, a woman prime minister. And in Sri Lanka, for women who enjoyed formal equality for an extremely long time, but not had substantive equality, these are significant gains. Because these are, I would argue, women who reach these positions based on their own merit and their own career trajectory, unlike some of the other women we've had in some of these positions. So that's one way. It looks like this is one way of dealing with state capture, where people choose to send a different group of people to parliament. But of course, as Rohan reminded us, parliament is in a fairly weak place in our constitutional system. So to what extent this reset can be leveraged for strengthening democracy is a tale that will remain to be told.
Right. I see another question from John Kurian to Rohan, and I quote the question: against the background of the sentiment for more devolution of power to the provinces, how do you see the possibility for more participatory democracy discussions as process in the matter of constitutional reform, or is this wishful thinking? I'm not paraphrasing this. I just read the question. Would you like me to read this again, Rohan?
No, it's fine. Thank you very much for the question. So just to clarify, I actually flagged the question of whether there is still a sentiment for more devolution of power. I mean, this is an interesting issue that has not only arisen in Sri Lanka, but in other countries, where the argument goes something like like this: the demand for federalism, devolution, often comes from elites within ethnic minority groups, and that ordinary people are more interested in other issues, health, water, service delivery type issues. And I think the results in the north have generated that as a question. Is that happening in Sri Lanka as well? Is that why some of the traditional Tamil parties have seemed to have been rejected? Or is it that it's still important, but this was a kind of protest vote against those Tamil political parties? But your point, your question, I think, was also about participatory democracy. I think that, you know, through the discussions on constitutional reform, we might be able to focus on some of those things. I know one of the big issues in the Aragalaya movement was they were advocating various direct democratic mechanisms and strategies. I have to confess that I'm very conscious of the dangers of strong participatory democracy, and I've told Uyang and Dinesha and Pradeep that this is a very interesting discussion that needs to take place in a more sort of academic environment, the pros and cons of direct democracy, how it fits with representative democracy. Can you fix representative democracy, which is totally discredited today, to address some of the concerns? But the last point I'd like to make is that I hope the government doesn't start the process of participatory constitution making from the beginning, because I think that's a luxury we cannot afford. There are discussions about whether participatory constitution making actually works in other parts of the world. So it's that tricky decision of trying to get a balance between participation, transparency, and openness on the one hand, engagement with civil society, and also ensuring that there's political will, and that the politicians don't use participation as an excuse not to provide leadership and direction when it comes to constitutional reform. I hope I've answered your question. Thank you.
Yeah, as you were talking, Rohan, I was thinking how strong and continuous the life of terms such as direct democracy is in South Asia. There's another.
Anubha, can I make a small intervention?
Yes, please, absolutely.
No, this is also like, in response to this social media question as well. But also while listening to Rohan and, Dinesha, and also I was reflecting what I was also saying, one of the things we are missing in this discussion, or maybe like in the general discussion today in Sri Lanka, because NPP made this victory, they achieved this something. People thought impossible. They made it possible by going against the conventions, with being more innovative and completely playing completely thinking out of the box. I think now the future of the NPP government and we as a civil society also may now start thinking outside of the box. And also we must ask questions outside of the standard, the questions. Because there's no point in terms of we expect NPP to come and really strengthen the procedural democracy in the standard liberal democratic the criterion. If that is all what we are going to achieve, I don't think they will be able to deliver or the produce that kind of substantive democracy that they've been promising and we were expecting. So I think our questions and critique can also need to be equally out of the box, as in PP. So coming back to this social media, the influence, I think definitely, yes, social media played a huge role. This is not something, we must not also romanticize social media. That can work both ways. But you see that, clearly the campaign, campaign on the ground was pretty silent. Because campaign on social media was very, 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 very heavy. Earlier we used to see the, very still pictures and, photographs, posters, but now you have a kind of a small video clips as a kind of campaign material. So things are also changing. And particularly with the social media, so it has really converted the political participation to different level. So I think NPP captures this change and they basically use it for their benefit. and old parties, traditional parties were completely like, in a disarray due to the very reason what, Rohan was explaining, because like, as a party institution, they were extremely corrupt, very centralized. It's individual-based parties. They never had a vision except for like, personal benefits. So they miss completely the election. So perhaps that explained why NPP managed to make such a resounding victory as well. I mean, not to really like steal the credit from NPP's agency, but also to like, not to like, ignore the fact that, traditional parties also played extremely poorly, weakly, like, that really contribute to that. So yes, social media played a huge role, but that doesn't mean that social media equal democracy. I mean, social media can, I mean, if you look around the world, even in our neighboring countries, it can also use extremely problematic, very repressive tool. Thank you.
Especially with artificial intelligence, you never know what you are really watching. So by the way, listeners, this was a response to Reverend Utkande Amatabhani's question, the 3 questions posed in the chat box. I'll move on to the next question, which is from Anita Rumeshi Pereira. And forgive me if I'm not getting the pronunciations right. This is to the entire panel, so feel free to jump in. How might the outcome of the Sri Lankan elections influence political trends or strategies in neighboring South Asian countries? I mean, social media can be a great starting point, Pradeep.
I'm sure that the South Asia must be relieved to see this kind of peaceful transition of power. I mean, and so this clearly shows that South Asia is more stable under the current government, because they have made it very clear that they will have sustained the policy of neutrality. And I heard that the president's first visit going to be to Delhi, so which means that status quo going to be continued. I think that's very important as far as South Asian geopolitics are concerned. So in that way, I think the outcome of the election is a relief for South Asia. But this is more than that. It's such a huge, the promise or the hope for South Asian democracy. I mean, democracy can go so bad, but still it can bounce back. Because there was a time in Sri Lanka, we thought that the democracy lost its capacity to self-reflect and self-correct. But time and again, like past decades, we have seen that how democracy continued to like fight back and capture its place. So in a way, it sends a very strong message to the Democrats across South Asia, and even I mean, you may be able to find solution to your own issues within the democracy. So I think in that way, it's a pretty good message.
Right. So we are sort of running short of time. And Dinesha, I know both of you talked about Nepal and Bangladesh in your presentation. So if you'd like to come in very quickly, that would be much appreciated.
Yeah, I'll just say briefly, Anubha, I was reflecting as Pradeep spoke about the 1990s, the little bit of work that I've done looking back at what South Asia was like in that period is very interesting. In Bangladesh, in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, you had people coming out and asking for democracy in very distinct ways, and that translated to institutional reform. To what extent each of those jurisdictional moments had an impact on the other, I don't know. But there seems to be this ability for South Asian jurisdictions to speak to each other. At the same time, I also want to say that while looking at ourselves as a South Asian jurisdiction is familiar and useful in terms of geopolitics, we are also part of other formations by choice and not by choice. So it's also important to look at ourselves in that way too. Thanks.
Right. Rohan, would you like to come in quickly?
No, Anubha, I'm conscious of time, so I'll pass. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rohan. Actually, the next question is to you. So this is from Ramani Hariharan. Aragalaya demanded systemic changes. It's related to not only governance, but systems of administration. Your comments, please.
Well, thank you, Ramani, for the question. If I understand your question correctly, I think I just want to say that to me, there's a close link between governance and system of administration. But your question, I think, reminds us that one of the interesting issues that needs to be discussed when constitutional reform is debated is whether we should go back to what we had earlier, the notion of an independent public service, sort of protected from governmental interference. I checked the NPP manifesto, and there's a kind of hint at that. They don't say independent public service, but they talk about politicization. And I think that's really important. And it will also be wonderfully ironic if under an NPP, JVP-led government, the independent public service is restored. Let's hope so. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Rohan, for that concise, thoughtful response. There are a couple of comments in the chat box. I don't know if there are general comments or one of them seems to be directed at Dinesha. And I'd be happy to share these comments with you once we are done with the talk. But we are almost to the time. So this has been wonderful. We have been very disciplined, and I guess that's the spirit of the moment. So we have reached the end of the discussion, and I thank you all for joining us today. I'm grateful to our distinguished speakers, Dinesha, Rohan, and Pradeep, for taking time to explain to us the nuances of the election verdict. I also thank all those at SSA for making this event possible. A shout out to Menaka. And above all, thank you to our dear audience for your patient participation in this conversation on democracy. Stay tuned for more on revdem.ceu.edu. Thank you once again. Bye.